One of the major programs that President Johnson put into effect was the Great Society, and his goal here was to end poverty. Two ways he did that was through education and healthcare. An example of education was the Head Start daycare program for low-income families, and Medicare and Medicaid, which was health insurance for both the elderly and the lower income groups of Americans. The Vietnam War was in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and the U.S. goal was to contain communism, stop the spread of communism. In addition, American companies wanted access to Vietnam's tin, oil, and rubber. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18, and this is because many Americans felt that if you could fight for your country, you should be able to vote for your leaders. The Gulf of Tonkin was a controversial event where they said that the communist Vietnamese attacked American ships, which was found to be false. This newspaper headline shows how it was going to affect Americans emotionally by saying that the United States was attacked by Vietnam, and at first many Americans supported this war. Later it was found to be a lie. In this picture we see many college students protesting, and we see a dead college student on the floor. Very sad story about the protests at Kent State University. To limit the president's power in a time of war, Congress passed the War Powers Act. It said that the president can send troops into a war, but only for 90 days. After that 90 days, the president would have to get Congress's approval. Since the Vietnam War was becoming very unpopular, President Nixon instituted something called Vietnamization, which was asking the Vietnamese to do most of the fighting and the U.S. would support with weapons. The Pentagon Papers was when Daniel Ellsberg released government secret documents showing that the U.S. was involved in Vietnam as early as the 1950s, and that a lot of what the American public was told were absolute lies, which led to a lot of anger. Shifting to the larger parts of the Cold War, the word détente means to ease tensions or reduce problems between two groups. And this was President Nixon's plan to reduce tensions with China and the Soviet Union, communist nations. This is one of the more positive things that came out of the Nixon administration, and many historians find it to have good effects as far as ending the Cold War. Nixon does, however, resign or step down from office because he lied to the American public about his administration's spying on his Democratic opponent during one of the presidential campaigns in the 70s. It became a huge controversy, and Americans lost faith in their government. To reduce the threat of nuclear violence and war, the United States and the Soviet Union conducted SALT talks, or Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. If you limit, you have less, so less weapons. So this does reduce tensions. This again is part of détente. Since the Eisenhower Doctrine stated that the U.S. would get involved in Middle East politics, many Iranians have gotten upset about the U.S. getting involved in their politics, and young college students in Iran took Americans hostage. And this made the President Carter, the next president, a Democrat, look very unpopular and weak in the eyes of Americans. President Carter did do some good in the Middle East, however, in his Camp David Accords, and this is where he helped broker or bring peace between the warring nations of Israel and Egypt. After a bad economy in the 1970s, the American people wanted a more positive and different direction for the country. Ronald Reagan, a former actor and governor of California, becomes president, and one of his main economic plans was to cut taxes on the wealthy and businesses which he had hoped would stimulate the U.S. economy. There's a lot of mixed evidence out there whether this worked or not, but that's something you could learn later in economics. Kind of going away from détente, Reagan created something called Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, where he wanted the U.S. military and science community to create satellites that could stop weapons from space. The Star Wars program gave a lot of popularity to American people, and he increased his support, though it did not take off or do much in the way of stopping any weapons. One of the major stains on the Reagan administration was the Iran-Contra affair, where the U.S. said it was trying to stop communism in South America and Latin America. But the Congress said that the president could not get any funds for that, so he sold weapons illegally to the Iranian government, which was seen as a terrorist government. And he used that money to fund different troops in Nicaragua. Some called them a terrorist group. So we look at the big picture at the end of the Cold War. We're looking at how tensions increase and then decrease between the US, the Soviet Union, and China. In this section of the notes, we're going to take some of the vocab and put them into different categories. Hopefully this will help your brain make some sense of the information. Again, if you have any questions or get confused, not sure how everything relates, be sure to schedule an extra help appointment where we can go through everything line by line.